Okay, we'll start with the Mangalacharan. Om Majnana-timirandasya Jnananjana-shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam yena tasmai Sri Gurave Namah Sri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam yena Bhutale Swayam Upagadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Udapatakamalам Sri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Sri Rupam Sagrajatam Sagana Raghunathan Vitam Stamsa Jivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Paljana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sagana Lalita Sri Vishakan Vitamsta He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpati Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namaste Napta Kanchana Gaurangi Radha Vrindavaneshwari ऋषभानुसुते देवी प्रणमामि हरिप्रिये वाञ्छाकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपासिन्धुभ्यश्च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः श्रीकृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौरभक्तवृंद हरे कृष्णा कृष्ण कृष्ण हरे 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 राम राम हरे 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 कृष्णा कृष्ण कृष्ण हरे राम राम हरे 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 कृष्णा कृष्ण कृष्ण हरे राम हरे हरे ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय Hey Krishna. Uh, Thank you for joining today's session. Today's session is a continuation of the previous small book reading session on Wednesday. So we have started with this book titled Beyond Birth and Death, and we are now in the first chapter. Just started. It's titled "We Are Not This Body." So, as Lord Krishna has explained in the Gita, starting from chapter 2. So, when the discourse of the Gita starts from verse 11, so the Supreme Lord starts by explaining to Arjuna about the distinction between the material body and the spirit soul. So, most of the parts which you have already covered are based on that. So, in the previous session, it was mostly related to that distinction, and also how the Buddhist school of thought, how they view about the existence of living entities. Like, they do not believe in the spirit soul, but as mentioned in the Gita itself, consciousness is a symptom of the spirit soul. So consciousness is the proof that soul exists. So no matter how much the modern scientists they argue that there's no soul, they tend to argue that life comes from material body, but they can never revive a person who is dead once the spirit soul or consciousness leaves the body. If life comes from matter, then using that the same dead body, which also consists of dead matter, it shouldn't be a problem for the modern scientists to revive the dead body, which is actually devoid of spirit soul. If what they argue is correct, then they should be able to revive any dead body which consists of only dead matter, but it is impossible because we start to identify a person as being dead the moment the spirit soul leaves the material body. So that's why consciousness cannot be denied. A body without consciousness is a dead body. So if to those who argue that there is no spirit soul, to those who argue that living entities are a combination of all sorts of material elements, chemicals, blood, flesh only, so they should be able to prove how they can revive a dead body which consists of nothing but dead matter if what they say is actually true, if life indeed comes from material elements only. But it is impossible because the moment the spirit soul leaves the body, there's no consciousness. And even in the modern scientific terminology, they talk about the state of being conscious, unconscious. So it cannot be denied that the spirit soul exists, no matter what the so-called modern scientists say. And the Buddhist school of thought, they also have a similar uh, ideology where they do not accept the existence of the soul, but uh, according to the Bhagavad Gita, the soul the soul exists, and the symptom of the soul is consciousness. So without consciousness, none of the living entities will continue to exist in the material body. Though the spirit soul leaves the material body, only that material body is termed as dead. The spirit soul still exists, but without the soul, the material body is just dead matter. It cannot function without the consciousness. Though um, though the person is regarded as dead, though the body is regarded as dead body, it is only because the soul is no longer present, but the soul continues to exist. It transmigrates from that dead body to a new body. The impersonalist followers of Shankaracharya, as well as the Vaishnavas following in the disciplic succession from Lord Sri Krishna, acknowledge the factual existence of the soul, but the Buddhist philosophers do not. The Buddhists contend that at a certain stage, the combination of matter produces consciousness, but this argument is refuted by the fact that although we may have all the constituents of matter at our disposal, we cannot produce consciousness from them. All the material elements may be present in a dead man, but we cannot revive that man to consciousness. So this is what, apart from the Buddhists, also the so-called modern scientists, they also often argue that there is no spirit soul. A living entity is conscious of matter only. They only regard the material body as the living entity. But if that is true, then any dead body can be brought back to life, because if they deny the existence of soul, then they should be able to prove how they can bring back a dead body which only consists of matter. And this has been the core of the discussion, is which has been presented in the book titled "Life Comes from Life." So that book is actually a compilation of all the morning walk conversations uh, between Srila Prabhupada and many other uh, scientists, medical professionals, and also uh, other professionals from various backgrounds. So the core of the book revolves around the arguments regarding whether life comes from life or life comes from matter. So in that book, actually the book was not written by Srila Prabhupada. It is actually just a compilation of the dialogues which happened between Srila Prabhupada and all the other medical professionals and scientists. So in those conversations, Srila Prabhupada very meticulously argues about the he argues in very in depth regarding the existence of the spirit soul, and he also challenges the modern scientists who deny the existence of spirit soul to create a living being using dead matter. Uh, all the material elements may be present in a dead man, but we cannot revive that man to consciousness. This body is not like a machine. When a part of a machine breaks down, it can be replaced and the machine will work again. But when the body breaks down and consciousness leaves the body, there's no possibility of our replacing the broken part and rejuvenating the consciousness. The soul is different from the body, and as long as the soul is there, the body is animate, but there's no possibility of making the body animate in the absence of the soul. So the body is not like a machine, because machines which are constructed using dead matter, they once they break down, they can be replaced using the spare parts. But once the human body breaks down, in the sense that once the consciousness leaves the body, there's no possibility of replacing any of the parts. Actually, the entire body becomes useless. So everything depends on the consciousness. Even if people argue about this transplant, that transplant, so even that is possible only as long as the soul exists in the body. So the uh, the entire universe itself, uh, meaning the material universes, the Mahatattva, meaning the combination of all the innumerable material universes, beginning from the first Purusha Avatara, from the incarnation of Mahavishnu, then Garbhodakashayi Vishnu, Shlodakashayi Vishnu. So this entire Mahatattva, which represents the material world, it it is nothing but dead matter, because it consists of the 24 elements. It consists of the 24 elements, which include the consciousness. But without consciousness, everything else is dead matter. So this entire material world itself is nothing but dead matter, but it appears to be animate only due to the existence of the spirit souls. So whatever, uh, if all the spirit souls cease to exist, or if all the spirit souls transmigrate from this material world to the spiritual world at once, then this entire material universe will become inanimate. So even the material universes, they also appear to be animate only due to the existence of spirit souls. This applies not just to human beings, but to all the 84 lakh species of material bodies. So it applies to all the living entities in this material world. So the living entities uh, take up a certain type of body based on their past activities, and once they receive a new body, the previous body is discarded, and they continue to progress, or they continue to progress according to their previous activities. Because we cannot perceive the soul by our gross senses, we deny it. Actually, there are so many things that are there which we cannot see. We cannot see air, radio waves, or sound, nor can we perceive minute bacteria with our blunt senses, but this does not mean they are not there. By the aid of the microscope and other instruments, many things can be perceived, which had previously been denied by the imperfect senses. So even in the field of material science, um, there have been a lot of deviations, or they tend to call it progress, because even when we look at the atomic theory, earlier the first proposal of the atomic theory was such that the atom is the smallest particle, and it was supposed to be the smallest indivisible particle. So that was one version. Then it was proven to be false. Then they came up with the subparticles like proton, electron, neutron. So like that, even the field of science is, though the scientists tend to call it progress or new discoveries, they will never admit that they messed up in the first place. So they won't acknowledge that they made mistakes in their previous theories. So they'll just try to cover up by saying that this is actually a new discovery, we are making progress. So that is mainly because whatever we perceive with our imperfect senses can never be 100% accurate, and therefore it is actually uh, just a sign of ignorance to always think that whatever we cannot see does not exist. So similarly, all the subject matters related to spirituality are always denied or rejected by the so-called modern scientists because they say that they cannot perceive using their senses. But even without uh, using their senses fully to view things like atoms or the bacteria, still they are able to view using uh, equipment like the microscope. So similarly, even to understand the spiritual topics, we need the aid of shastras, guru sadhu shastra. Just because the soul, which is atomic in size, had not been perceived yet by senses or instruments, we should not conclude that it is not there. It can, however, be perceived by its symptoms and effect. So the simplest example is that uh, even the medical scientists, they say that uh, they tend to identify patients like being in the conscious state or unconscious state, though they do not directly acknowledge the existence of soul. But it is stated in the Gita itself in chapter 2 that consciousness is the symptom of soul. So the moment the soul completely leaves the body, then the body becomes nothing but dead matter. So that is the symptom of the existence of the soul. No matter how much the modern scientists try, they cannot bring back that dead matter to life, because that uh, that life itself, which is nothing but the spirit soul, has already left from that material body. In the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna points out that all our miseries are due to false identification with the body. From Gita 2.14, Matra Svarshatu Kaunteya, Sidoshna Sugadukara, Agama Paino Anityas, Tam Stitik Sashva Bharata. O son of Kunti, the non-permanent appearance of happiness and distress, and their disappearance in due course, are like the appearance and disappearance of winter and summer seasons. They arise from sense perception, or sign of Bharata, and one must learn to tolerate them without being disturbed. In the proper discharge of duty, one has to learn to tolerate non-permanent appearances and disappearances of happiness and distress. According to Vedic injunction, one has to take his bath early in the morning, even during the month of Magha, January, February, or in the Tamil calendar, known as Margali. It is very cold at that time. But in spite of that, a man who abides by the religious principles does not hesitate to take his bath. Similarly, a woman does not hesitate to cook in the kitchen in the months of May and June, the hottest part of the summer season. One has to execute his duty in spite of climatic inconveniences. Similarly, to fight is the religious principle of the Kshatriyas. And although one has to fight with some friend or relative, one should not deviate from his prescribed duty. One has to follow the prescribed rules and regulations of religious principles in order to rise up to the platform of knowledge, because by knowledge and devotion only one can liberate himself from the clutches of Maya illusion. So even like what we saw from yesterday's session, in yesterday's thematic study session titled The Purpose of Bhagavad Gita. So the Bhagavad Gita itself was spoken by the Supreme Lord Sri Krishna to Arjuna, because Arjuna was in distress due to identifying himself too much with uh, based on material designations. So when we talk about the self actually refers to the spirit souls. Even from this chapter, uh, from this first chapter of Beyond Birth and Death. In the previous session, okay, it is stated that the very first step in self-realization is realizing one's identity as separate from the body. So uh, in the topic of self-realization, so whenever we talk about self-realization, so it is about realizing the self. So it can be as simple as realizing who is the self. So the self refers to the spirit soul. Uh, though it appears to be very simple, but we as the conditioned souls, we do not really practice what we preach simply because we are always under the clutches of Maya, and therefore we are always forced to identify ourselves with various material designations, just like Arjuna, who was in ignorance because he was identifying himself too much with his material designations. He was in distress because he was unable to fight against his relatives. So he was viewing everything from the perspective of material designations. So that is how we, the conditioned souls, are uh, put into illusion by Maya, because it it prevents us from realizing our original constitutional position. So the first step in self-realization is to identify that we are not this material body, but we are spirit souls, and it should culminate in uh, identifying in realizing our original identity, original constitutional position as eternal servants of the Supreme Lord. It is not merely enough if we understand that we are not this material body, but we are spirit souls. Okay, that's fine. But if, after realizing that we are spirit souls, we also have to further inquire about why we, the spirit souls, are stuck here in the material world. Spirit and matter are completely two uh, opposing elements, because as explained in the Gita itself, from verses 2.11 to 2.30, so in the very first section, in the very first subtopic of the Gita, the Supreme Lord Krishna, he explains about the distinctions between the spirit soul and the material body. And if we study in those verses from 2.11 to 2.30, all the features and qualities of the spirit soul and material body are completely opposites of each other. So upon realizing that we are spirit souls, we should further inquire why are we stuck here in the material world, which is obviously not is not meant to be our uh, original place of residence, because this material world is nothing but dead matter. But what are we doing here um, uh, in this material world, which is actually it doesn't suit our nature as spirit souls? Then why are we here? So this is how we gradually progress in our spiritual inquiry, and it should culminate in understanding that our original constitutional position is that we are spirit souls, and we are part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, and we are meant to be his eternal servants. Our original constitutional position is that we are servants. There's also a quote by Srila Prabhupada where he says that uh, all all the living entities are servants. None of the living entities are meant to be masters. So either we are a servant of Krishna directly in his association, or we are servants of Maya. But even the conditioned souls who are servants of Maya, they are also indirectly the servants of the Supreme Lord still, because even Maya itself is the inferior energy of the Supreme Lord. So, despite our tendencies, despite our desires to become enjoyers and controllers, uh, because of which we have ended up in this material world, we are still somehow, we still remain in the position of servants of the Supreme Lord, though indirectly, but the the main the most undesired part about this is that when we choose to become servants of Maya instead of being uh, the eternal servants of the Supreme Lord directly in the spiritual world, then we have to suffer the problems of Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadi. So that is why we can never escape from being a servant. Either we have to be a servant of the Supreme Lord in the spiritual world, or we'll be the servants of Maya in the material world. But uh, if we choose to be servants of Maya, of course, we can enjoy material sense gratification, but it comes with the additional package of the uh, repeated cycles of birth, death, old age, and disease. So we have to be, in order to be clear about self-realization, it is as simple as, it can be as simple as realizing who is the self, what is meant by the self, but it is not, uh, it may not necessarily be equally simple when it comes to applying it in our daily life, because such is the uh, influence of Maya on the conditioned souls. So even in the case of Arjuna, who is actually an exalted devotee, he was in distress in the first chapter of the Gita, because he was viewing everything from the material perspective. He was also, like any other conditioned soul, he was also thinking that he is the material body, and therefore he was identifying all his relatives based on mere bodily relations. So that was the cause of his distress. And after understanding the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, he, as he says in the last chapter in 18.73, his illusions have been cleared, and he was prepared to act according to the instruction of the Supreme Lord. He says, Karishe Vachanam Tava. So the person who really understands the Bhagavad Gita will be able to realize that he is the eternal servant of the Supreme Lord, and he should be always prepared to act according to the instructions of the Supreme Lord. So the Supreme Lord has given us all the instructions that we need in the Bhagavad Gita. So we have to uh, realize that we are eternal servants of the Supreme Lord, and uh, our nature itself as spirit souls who are eternal fragmental parts of the Supreme Lord, our nature is to be his eternal servants, and uh, this realization should culminate in devotional service. It is not enough if we simply understand these concepts, like the differences between material body and spirit soul, then we perceive the evil of Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadi. So we may have all these theoretical knowledge, but we will only be able to practically apply it through uh, devotional service. So from the purport of 2.14, the two different names of address given to Arjuna are also significant. To address him as Kaunteya signifies his great blood relations from his mother's side, and to address him as Bharata signifies his greatness from his father's side. From both sides, he is supposed to have a great heritage. A great heritage brings responsibility in the matter of proper discharge of duties. Therefore, he cannot avoid fighting. So Arjuna was in distress to the point where he was unable to execute his prescribed duty, and this distress was due to the influence of Maya, which forces all the conditioned souls who are originally spirit souls, but we are forced to identify ourselves with the material body, despite the fact that this material body is temporary and only our soul is eternal. So, whether we are in the uh, spiritual world or in the material world, we as spirit souls, we are eternal beings, but still we have been degraded to the position where we, out of illusion, we are forced to identify ourself with temporary material bodies. In the summertime, we may feel pleasure from contact with water, but in the winter, we may shun that very water because it is too cold. In either case, the water is the same, but we perceive it as pleasant or painful due to its contact with the body. All feelings of distress and happiness are due to the body. So, as mentioned in this verse from Gita 2.14, uh, Sidoshna Sugadukara, the seasons of summer, winter, happiness, distress, they will always be there. Uh, and since we are trapped in this material world, we have no other choice but to tolerate all these dualities. So whether it's summer, winter, happiness, distress, profit, loss, so this material world will always be full of these dualities. So those who want happiness, they should also be always be prepared to face distress. And uh, in this degraded position from our original position in the spiritual world, we have come to this degraded position where we are helplessly going through this cycle for no reason, only to enjoy material sense gratification. Due to our material contamination, we ended up here in the material world, and this cycle will keep going on as long as we are not cleansed of our material contamination. So the wise people who understand that they are suffering in this material world, if they want to be free of distress, then there's no other choice but to be free from all dualities, because as long as we are trapped in this material world, it will always be full of dualities, and we have to accept both. We cannot simply choose only happiness and reject distress. If we are so deluded to keep enjoying material sense gratification, then we should also be ready to experience both happiness and distress. But for human beings who have achieved an exalted position, because out of the 84 lakh species of material bodies, the 4 lakh human species are regarded as the exalted ones, because only this species has the ability to be engaged in spiritual inquiry and devotional service. And even from the Bhagavatam, there are verses from Canto 3 especially. Lord Brahma and even the demigods, they say that human beings who are born in this middle region of the material universe, meaning in the planet Earth, that too in the Bharatavarsha and Bharatakanta, they are extremely fortunate because um, they have the ability to be engaged in devotional service and to liberate themselves from this material world. So, in order to in order to qualify ourselves to be liberated from this material world and attain the spiritual world, we have to also um, be prepared to be in equanimity whenever we face these dualities, just like happiness, distress, profit, loss. So uh, that is also part of becoming detached from the material entanglement and material designations. So the more we start to attach ourselves with spirituality, we also have to detach ourselves from all the material designations. And as we succeed in that direction, we will be able to maintain equanimity in the face of all these dualities. All feelings of distress and happiness are due to the body. So a person who is truly a self-realized person, he should be able to tolerate all the different sense perceptions which occur due to the various dualities in the material world. Under certain conditions, the body and mind feel happiness and distress. Factually, we are hankering after happiness, for the soul's constitutional position is that of happiness. The soul is part and parcel of the Supreme Being, who is Satchidananda Vigraha, the embodiment of knowledge, bliss, and eternity. Indeed, the very name Krishna, which is non-sectarian, means the greatest pleasure. Krish means greatest, and Na means pleasure. Krishna is the epitome of pleasure, and being part and parcel of him, we hanker for pleasure. So again, this also refers to verse 15.7 from the Bhagavad Gita. In chapter 15, verse number 7, the Supreme Lord says, Pamevamso Jivaloke Jivabhuta Sanatana. All the living entities are eternal fragmental parts of the Supreme Lord. So we being part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, we have qualitative similarity with him. A drop of ocean water has all the properties of the ocean itself, and we, although minute particles of the Supreme Whole, have the same energetic properties as the Supreme. Though we have qualitative similarity, the exact words used here is qualitative similarity, not qualitative sameness or qualitative equality. So we have qualitative similarity. So we are somewhat similar to Supreme Lord, but we are not the same. And that's why it is extremely foolish to regard that all living entities are equal to Supreme Lord, or even these so-called oneness with the Supreme Lord or merging with the Supreme Lord. The Supreme Lord himself says that living entities are his eternal fragmental parts. We are eternally fragmented. So there was never a time when we were one with the Supreme Lord, and we are never going to be one with him or merge with him. Even after liberation, we are all going to remain as individuals, as the eternal fragmental parts of the Supreme Lord, even in the spiritual world. So that is what the Supreme Lord himself says in the Gita, especially in chapter 15. The atomic soul, although so small, is moving the entire body to act in so many wonderful ways. In the world, we see so many cities, highways, bridges, great buildings, monuments, and great civilizations. But who has done all this? It is all done by the minute spirit spark within the body. If such wonderful things can be performed by the minute spirit spark, we cannot begin to imagine what can be accomplished by the Supreme Spirit whole. The natural hankering of the minute spirit spark is for the qualities of whole, knowledge, bliss, and eternity. But these hankerings are being frustrated due to the material body. The information on how to attain the soul's desire is given in the Bhagavad Gita. So we, as the minute particles of the Supreme Lord, we are able to achieve to a certain extent. These, though these so-called material progress, these are actually nothing when viewed from the spiritual perspective. But still, even this, we, the deluded conditioned souls, we tend to think so greatly of ourselves due to the so-called material progress or material development that occurs. But none of these so-called progress can give the solution to the problems of birth, death, old age, and disease. So despite all the so-called scientific and technological progress that a lot of people tend to boast about, none of these progress has been able to provide a solution to the problems of Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadhi. So that's why we cannot find the solutions to these real problems of our life from the uh, so-called academic institutions. It is only available from spiritual knowledge. It is only available from the Shastras. So even with so much limited and uh, temporary progress, we become so puffed up, but the entire material world, the Mahatattva, is only 1/4 of the entire creation, as mentioned in the Srimad Bhagavatam, in the conversation between Lord Brahma and Narada Muni. There are two verses in the second canto, chapter 6, verses 19 and 20. In those two verses, Lord Brahma talks about the three pada vibhuti and eka pada vibhuti. So this material world is regarded as eka pada vibhuti, meaning 1/4 of the total creation, and the spiritual world is regarded as three pada vibhuti, 3/4 of the entire creation. So we, the deluded conditioned souls, who are known as the human beings, we actually inflict so much damage to the planet, and still we are so puffed up, and we boast about material progress and development. But the entire material uh, universe itself is just 1/4 of the Supreme Lord's total creation. So uh, the spiritual world is actually 3 times greater than the material world, and it is fully illuminated by the Brahmajyoti effulgence, which emanates from the Supreme Lord's transcendental body. So that's why it is absolutely foolish to regard ourselves to be equal to the Supreme Lord. There is qualitative similarity between us and the Supreme Lord, but we are not the same. The natural hankering of the minute spirit spark is for the qualities of the whole, knowledge, bliss, and eternity. But these hankerings are being frustrated due to the material body. So, though we have the qualities of uh, eternity, bliss, and knowledge, but due to our degraded position, originally we as spirit souls, we are also full of eternity, knowledge, and bliss. But due to our current degraded position, where we have become embodied souls, we are trapped in the material bodies. So we are forced to undergo all this frustration and suffering. The information on how to attain the soul's desire is given in the Bhagavad Gita. At present, we are trying to attain eternity, bliss, and knowledge by means of an imperfect instrument. Actually, our progress toward these goals is being blocked by the material body. Therefore, we have to come to the realization of our existence beyond the body. So we uh, as long as we deny the existence of the spirit soul uh, in the name of scientific knowledge, we are blocking ourselves from the path of self-realization. So the very, as we saw earlier in the earlier part of this chapter, the very first step in self-realization is to understand that we are not this material body, we are spirit souls. But those who are completely deluded due to the influence of Maya, though they may call themselves scientists, um, they are actually blocking their own paths towards self-realization. So as long as uh, they continue to deny the existence of the spirit soul, they themselves are blocking their uh, path towards progress in self-realization. So if they refuse to accept the existence of the spirit soul, they they will never understand that they themselves are spirit souls. They will fail to understand the meaning of the self in self-realization. And that's why all our so-called material progress are always being frustrated. No matter how many skyscrapers are built, so either it will get destroyed in seconds, maybe it might be due to a terrorist attack, or it might even be due to some earthquake, which all come under the threefold miseries of material existence: adhyatmic, adevik, adibautik. And that's why we should not consider ourselves as being so great and become puffed up with all our so-called material progress. As long as we identify ourselves with all these material aspects, we are blocking our path in self-realization. Theoretical knowledge that we are not these bodies will not do. We have to keep ourselves always separate as masters of the body, not as servants. If we know how to drive a car well, it will give us good service. But if we do not know how, we will be in danger. So the topic of self-realization can be as simple as realizing the self as separate from the body. But we have to understand that the self or spirit soul should be superior to the material body. But due to our material contamination, we are unable to um, control and keep our material senses to the position of being subservient to the soul. So this itself is a very huge topic, which has also been explained in the Katha Upanishad under the topic of Radha Kalpana. So there is a certain hierarchy which explains about the position of the soul and how the material senses and further still the sense objects should be kept as subservient to the soul. But the problem with us, the contaminated and conditioned, the materially contaminated and conditioned souls, we are unable to retain the superiority of the spirit soul. So due to the material contamination, the soul itself becomes enslaved to the material senses and sense objects. So the that is the crux of our problem in material existence. The body is composed of senses, and the senses are always hungry after their objects. So we have material senses, and the sense objects also exist as part of the Mahatattva. So the 24 Mahatattva elements, they include the material senses and also the sense objects. The eyes see a beautiful person and tell us, oh, there's a beautiful girl, a beautiful boy, let's go see. The ears are telling us, oh, there's a very nice music, let's go hear it. The tongue is saying, oh, there's a very nice restaurant with palatable dishes, let us go. In this way, the senses are dragging us from one place to another, and because of this, we are perplexed. So the sense objects are nothing but dead matter, which are also part of the Mahatattva elements, and our material senses should be able to resist these temptations of the sense objects. But our soul itself is in such a degraded position that the soul becomes fully controlled by the mind, and the mind itself is controlled by the material senses, and the material senses are dominated by these temptations of the sense objects. So this is how the exalted position of the spirit soul becomes degraded due to the attraction towards sense objects. And there are also two important verses in chapter 2 of the Gita, 2.62 and 2.63. So both these verses consist of 4 lines. So total 8 lines, and these 8 lines, they represent the 8 steps towards destruction, starting from contemplation on sense objects. So in Gita 2.62, the verse is Jayato Vishayan Punsam Sangateshu Bachayate Sangat Sanjayate Kamat Kamakrodo Abhijayate Krodhat Bhavati Samoha Samohat Smriti Viprama Smriti Branshat Bhuttinashat Pranashati. So in those two verses, they talk about the Supreme Lord talks about 8 steps towards total destruction, how the exalted position of the self, the spirit soul, gets degraded to the position of being slaves of Maya. So in the first line in Gita 2.62, Jayato Vishayan Pumsam, it means that we, the conditioned souls, we, through our material senses, we contemplate on sense objects. Sangateshu Upajayate, due to this contemplation on sense objects, it develops attachment. Sangat Sanjayate Kamat, from attachment, lust develops. Kama Krodho Abhijayate, when that lust is unfulfilled, anger develops. So that is in verse 2.62, and these are the initial 4 steps of degradation. In verse 2.63, Krodhat Bhavati Samoha, from anger, it causes bewilderment, illusion. Samohat Smriti Viprama, then it causes loss of memory. Smriti Brahmshat Buddhi Nasho, from loss of memory, it leads to the destruction of intelligence. Buddhi Nashat Pranashati, when intelligence is lost, it leads to total destruction. So total destruction is nothing but our current degraded condition, where we as the superior spirit souls, we have become we have been degraded to this position of being dominated by not just the material senses but also the sense objects. The sense objects are nothing but date matter. They are just objects, but our material senses are running behind them, and that is the main cause of our degradation. So the only way to reverse this process is to engage all our material senses in Krishna consciousness instead of running behind these sense objects, which only lead us to further degraded conditions, especially in our current birth, since we have obtained this wonderful opportunity of being born in the human form of life. So this is the perfect opportunity for us to be engaged in spiritual inquiry, and which should culminate in devotional service. So if we do not utilize this opportunity to engage our material senses in Krishna consciousness, then we are only going to develop a certain type of body which will allow us to experience material sense gratification even in the next birth, but that will most probably be a further degraded form of life, because in this form of life, which is a very exalted position, which is ideal to be absorbed in devotional service, this is our opportunity to liberate ourselves from this material entanglement. But if we do not utilize this opportunity, then we will end up in a much more degraded form of life, like in the animal form in the next birth. So that's why it is important to understand uh, how uh, how and where we actually went wrong, and the only way to reverse this blunder is by engaging all our material senses in Krishna consciousness. So that's why we simply have to follow the instructions of the Supreme Lord uh, in the Bhagavad Gita, and the main verdict of the Bhagavad Gita is that we can attain perfection by becoming devotees, not by being engaged in Karma Yoga or Jnana Yoga. as the Supreme Lord himself says, Bhakti Yoga is the topmost yoga system, and the Supreme Lord personally favors the devotees. So, how do we become devotees who are favorable to the Supreme Lord? By being engaged in devotional service. And even regarding devotional service, there are many descriptions about devotional service in the Srimad Bhagavatam involving the Navayada Bhakti, and also in other scriptures like Nectar of Devotion. So, Prabhupada also describes this as making the best use of a bad bargain. So we cannot deny the fact that we are now embodied souls. We are embodied in this temporary material body, but still we can utilize our time. We can make full use of it by engaging our material senses in devotional service. So we cannot simply liberate ourselves from this engagement, from this material engagement. It's not like the moment we realize that we are not this material body, but we are spirit souls, we won't be liberated straight away to the spiritual world. We still have to um, utilize our time here in the material world by being engaged in devotional service, so that we develop the ideal consciousness which would enable us to enter the spiritual world. As the Supreme Lord himself says in Gita 8.5, Antakale Samameva Smaran Muktva Kalevaram Ya Prayati Samadbhavam Yati Nashtriyata Samshayaha. So those who remember the Supreme Lord at the time of death can enter the spiritual world. And it is not as simple as remembering the Supreme Lord only at the time of death. We will only be able to remember him at the time of death if we keep practicing to remember him throughout our lifetime. So the only way to do it is by practicing Krishna consciousness, and that's why the Supreme Lord further clarifies in Gita 8.7, Tasmat Sarveshu Kaleshu Ma Manusmana Yudhyacha Mai Arpita Mano Buddhir Mame Vaishashi Asamshaya. So just because the Supreme Lord says that by remembering him at the time of death, we can enter the spiritual world, it doesn't mean that we can indulge in all sorts of nonsense throughout our lifetime and remember him at the time of death. The favorable conditions required to remember the Supreme Lord at the time of death will only be available to us if we practice remembering him throughout our lifetime. And that's why the Supreme Lord himself says in 8.7 to always remember him and do our duty. Tasmat Sarveshu Kaleshu Ma Manusmana Yudhyacha. So we always have to, in addition to being engaged in our material duties, we also have to practice Krishna consciousness and be engaged in devotional service by utilizing our material senses as much as possible to be engaged in devotional service through chanting, hearing, and also by studying the Shastras. So this is the only way that is possible to reverse our blunder. Earlier, our blunder was that we let our soul to be dominated by the material senses and also by sense objects. But through Krishna consciousness, we can reverse this blunder by engaging all our material senses in devotional service to the Supreme Lord. So that will create the favorable conditions to enable us to remember the Supreme Lord throughout our lifetime, and also we will also be able to remember him even at the time of death, so that we can regain our original transcendental body and attain the spiritual world, to be always engaged in devotional service to the Supreme Lord as his eternal servants. So that is the only way to reverse our blunder. So that's all for today. We'll continue the remainder in the next session. Thank you. Any questions or comments?
No, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.